At 2:30 p.m. local time in the Caribbean Sea, two Venezuelan F-16 fighting Falcons roared in low, cutting across the sky just a few hundred feet above the waves. Their target wasn't a smuggler's boat or a training range. It was the USS Jason Dunham, a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke destroyer bristling with sensors and missiles. On radar, the blips appeared fast, closing the distance. The bridge of the American warship knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't an innocent flyby. It was a deliberate provocation, a game of chicken. Except this one involved supersonic jets and billion-dollar hardware. The Pentagon later called the move reckless. CBS News described it as the second time in just 2 days Venezuelan jets had done the same stunt. But for the sailors standing watch on the destroyer, labels didn't matter. All they knew was that the two Cold War-era fighters were charging toward them, their afterburners glowing like torches in the Caribbean sky. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro wanted to show strength to remind Washington that Caracas couldn't be intimidated after a U.S. strike sank a suspected cartel-run speedboat just days earlier. But in choosing this stunt, his pilots were about to learn the hard way. Intimidation cuts both ways. Because while they thought they were sending a message, they had no idea that they were handing the U.S. Navy a priceless gift. The F-16s came in hot, banking low enough that their shock waves rippled across the water. On the bridge of the Jason Dunham, every sailor knew the drill. Standard procedure. Stay calm. Keep course and let the ship's layered defenses do the talking. The first warning came over the radio. A calm American voice transmitted on open frequencies. Unidentified aircraft. You are approaching a United States warship operating in international waters. Maintain safe distance. The Venezuelan pilots gave no response. Instead, one of them lit his afterburner, blasting past the bow in a streak of orange flame. Inside the Combat Information Center, the real fight was already underway. The ship's ANP-1 radar, the beating heart of the Aegis combat system, had tagged the incoming jets long before the crew even saw them. Data scrolled across the consoles. Altitude, speed, bearing. Weapons officers armed the ship's layer defense suite. SM-2 Surfacito air missiles in the vertical launch cells. RIM 162 Sea Sparrows for close-in interception, and the last line, the Phalanx C was Gatling gun. If the Venezuelan fighters made a wrong move, the destroyer could swat them down in seconds. But firing wasn't the goal. The captain stood calm, arms crossed, eyes on the tactical display. His orders were clear. Do not escalate unless directly threatened. The Jason Dunham was in international waters with every right to be there. The real danger wasn't the aircraft themselves. It was the possibility of one miscalculation spiraling into an international incident. From the deck, sailors looked up as the second F-16 screamed overhead, so low that its shadow briefly cut across the destroyer's missile hatches. To an untrained eye, it looked like Venezuela had won the intimidation game. But in reality, the opposite was true. Every radio call that the pilots made back to Caracas, every sweep of their radar, every flicker of their targeting systems, it was all being soaked up by the Jason Dunham's electronic warfare suite. The closer they flew, the more they revealed. The Venezuelans thought they were flexing. What they didn't realize was that they had already stepped into America's data trap. USS Jason Dunham wasn't just any ship. She's an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, essentially a floating fortress. Her radar dome, the ANS Spy or Spy 1, can track hundreds of targets at once, from sea-skimming missiles to high-flying jets. For the crew, a pair of F-16s buzzing the deck barely registered as a threat compared to what the ship was built to fight. So the question is, why was the Navy even here in the first place in Venezuelan waters? Well, the answer goes back just days, not even months. On September 2nd, American aircraft had destroyed a speedboat in the Caribbean, accusing it of belonging to Venezuela's powerful Tren Aragua cartel. 11 were killed in that strike, an operation the White House called a success in the war on narcotics. In Caracas, the incident was viewed very differently. President Nicolas Maduro condemned the attack as a violation of sovereignty, vowing retaliation. Just days later, his F-16s were screaming across the Caribbean sky. Ironically, those very jets were once supplied to Venezuela by the United States. Back in the 1980s, Venezuela purchased dozens of F-16 as the time cutting edge. For decades later, the fleet is showing its age. Spare parts are scarce, avionics are outdated, and maintenance is a constant struggle. Still, in Maduro's hands, they became symbols of defiance. Fast, loud, and dramatic, even if no longer truly modern. That contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, Cold War relics straining to look menacing. On the other, a destroyer tied into one of the most advanced naval networks on Earth, supported by satellites, drones, and a full carrier strike group nearby. From the outside, the F-16s looked like they held the upper hand, but the reality was different. The closer they flew, the more they exposed. The Venezuelans' F-16s gave it all away. Their fire control radars painted the Jason Dunham trying to look threatening. Instead, they handed over precise waveforms that Navy analysts could catalog and file. Their radios lit up with chatter back to coastal bases. The ship's ANSLQ-32 electronic warfare system soaked it all in, logging which frequencies were used, how secure the comms were, and even the exact moment the pilots keyed their mics. And then came the infrared. By diving low and blasting afterburners, the fighters left massive thermal trailers in the humid Caribbean air. The destroyer's IR sensors captured it all. For the Navy, it was like photographing fingerprints at a crime scene. Priceless, undeniable evidence of how Venezuela's jets really perform under stress. The irony is brutal. Caracas wanted to intimidate, to project strength. But the intimidation at close range is noisy. And in the electronic battle space, noise is death. Every flare, every radar ping, every afterburner burst wasn't scaring the US. It was feeding its databases. To Venezuelan command back on land, the footage might play like victory. Jets screaming over US warship Defiant and Bold. But the analysts watching from Norfolk or Pearl Harbor saw something else entirely. They saw vulnerabilities, cataloged weaknesses, and completed a library of Venezuela's aging air fleet being delivered on a silver platter. By the time the F-16s finally banked away, the Jason Dunham's crew hadn't even flinched. They didn't need to. Venezuela had already made its biggest mistake, mistaking noise for power. And while those pilots thought they had rattled America's cage, they had actually opened the door to something more dangerous. Escalation. The flyovers might have looked like theatrics, but Washington didn't laugh. Within hours, the Pentagon labeled the incident as reckless and provocative. And President Donald Trump made the message crystal clear. Any Venezuelan aircraft that endangers our ships will be shot down. That wasn't empty talk. Just days later, 10 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters arrived in Puerto Rico. Just a 2-hour flight from Venezuelan airspace. These weren't aging jets from the 1980s. These were America's crown jewel. 5th-generation fighters designed to slip past radars and dismantle enemy defenses before the first warning siren even sounds. Their deployment was a signal. If Caracas wanted to gamble in the skies, the stakes had just gone up. Meanwhile, the Jason Dunham wasn't alone. Behind her stood the weight of an entire US Navy task force. Destroyers, cruisers, supply ships, even amphibious assault vessels. Carrying Marines were patrolling the Caribbean. Overhead, P-8 Poseidon's patrol aircraft scanned the waters while drones watched from higher still. One destroyer might look isolated on the horizon, but in reality, it was plugged into a layered shield stretching across the entire region. For Venezuela, that created a brutal imbalance. Their F-16s could buzz, maybe even harass, but they couldn't change the facts. Their air force lacked modern missiles, lacked stealth, and lacked the logistics to sustain a long fight. Even if they wanted to, matching American firepower was impossible. And yet, provocation has a dangerous logic. One wrong move, a missile lock, a misinterpreted radio call, and the situation could have gone from noisy flybys to a shooting war in seconds. The US destroyer's crew knew it. The Venezuelan pilots probably felt it in their cockpits, too. A game of chicken is only fun until someone doesn't swerve. Maduro may have hoped the flyovers would rally domestic pride and send Washington a warning. Instead, they triggered the exact opposite. A surge of US military presence in the Caribbean and a clear promise that the next close pass might end in flames. Because when you square off against the US Navy, there's one rule that never changes. Don't mistake restraint for weakness. From the outside, Venezuela's flyovers looked like defiance. Jets roaring past a US destroyer, daring America to react. But scratched beneath the surface, and it was a textbook case of overconfidence, turning into self-sabotage. Strategically, the hunt handed Washington everything it wanted. The Navy collected radar fingerprints, comms protocols, and thermal data from Venezuela's most capable fighters, all without firing a single shot. In military terms, that's a jackpot. Intelligence like this isn't flashy, but in the next crisis, it can mean the difference between surprise and dominance. This wasn't the first time an adversary made the same mistake. Just months ago in the South China Sea, a Chinese Z-10 attack helicopter tried to rattle a US MH-60R. Instead, it handed over electronic signatures that American analysts stored away for future conflicts. In the Red Sea, Houthi fighters launched a missile at a Navy Seahawk, expecting a propaganda victory. Instead, They exposed their tactics, got tracked, and lost their launch site in seconds. Different actors, same story. Intimidation stunts that backfired into gifts for US intelligence. For Caracas, the lesson is brutal. Flying low and fast might thrill crowds back home, but against an Aegis-equipped destroyer, it's just background noise. Worse, it undercuts Venezuela's strategic position. Instead of looking strong, it highlights weakness. Aging aircraft against a fleet designed for global war. Every pass over a US warship becomes another data point in America's growing library of adversary playbooks. And for Washington, the takeaway is just as clear. Stay calm, hold fire, and let the other side make the mistakes. Escalation isn't always about pulling the trigger. Sometimes the smartest move is to wait, listen, and collect everything your opponent is foolish enough to broadcast. Because in modern warfare, silence wins battles, and arrogance loses them. By the time the Venezuelan F-16s turned for home, the Jason Dunham hadn't changed course, hadn't fired a missile, and hadn't flinched. To the sailors on board, it was just another entry into the ship's log. But to analysts watching the data streams, it was gold. Venezuela had tried to rattle the cage. It ended up rattling itself. The broader lesson is simple. The side that stays calm usually wins. Flybys, flares, and chest thumping don't change the balance of power. What matters is discipline, training, and the ability to turn noise into knowledge. And on that score, the US Navy walked away with the upper hand without even breaking a sweat. But here's the real question. If you were standing on the bridge of that destroyer watching two supersonic fighters dive low across your bow, what would you have done? Would you have fired a warning shot or held steady and trusted your ship's defenses? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see how you'd handle it. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves maritime stories. And as always, if you want to go a step further and support the channel directly, join the fleet. You get loyalty badges, priority responses, and you'll help us bring more true maritime stories to the surface. Just click join on our channel page and get on board. Because in this game of chicken, Venezuela thought it was holding the stronger hand. The US Navy proved otherwise. I'll see you in the next one.